Palestinian political scene. And it doesn't have a position which is different from the Palestinian and, one should say, the international community position on the right of return. This is what the position is all about. The right of return is an internationally recognized position. Does that mean that the BDS is going to forcefully bring the Palestinian refugees back home? No. It just says that part of the campaign against oppression is changing the conversation about the right of return. The reason Israel doesn't want the right of return, no, it's not because it will be suicidal. It's because it will stop being a racist state if it will not decide who comes in and who comes out just according to religion. The balance of power on the ground is playing in Israel's favor, no doubt. It has the strongest military power. It is the strongest military power in the Middle East. It has more money than the Palestinians. That's true. We are not changing the balance of power on the ground right now. But we hope to redeem this balance. We hope to...
I think that as an Israeli, I should say that I think we are exceptionally lucky to have so much international attention focused on our conflict. I think that if we haven't, it would be much more brutal, much more bloody, and so many more people would have died. For one thing, I think the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians would have been completed by now, if it wasn't for constantly holding up Israel to higher standards. And as an Israeli, I want to hold up my country to higher standards, simply because I want my country to be a better place. So you can't, yes, there are plenty of other cases to address, but I think a success in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict will help us address other issues rather than hinder them.
Yeah, there's a couple of comments I want to make, just briefly, which is that I just wanted to highlight the fact that the examples that John gave earlier about settler violence, Tom Friedman, bus segregation, none of them are as a result of BDS. They are all internal forces working inside Israel, and I think that, and internal dynamics with the American Jewish community. I certainly did not say that the reason that Bibi Netanyahu is elected is because of BDS. That is absolutely not what I said at all. I think that in answer to your question, why does the PA get to waive your right of return? I'm talking about the PLO being the elected representative body of the Palestinian people that is internationally recognised, which is why we as an organisation would never, do not support the notion that Bibi Netanyahu has laid out, that actually before you sit down and negotiate, you have to recognise us as a Jewish state, because that is recognising that is waiving the recognition of your right to return. But I think the reality is that and the problem I have with this whole conversation, and the problem I have with what Ilan just said, is that actually, I accept that what goes on over the Green Line is rogue. I think the settlement expansion is rogue. I think that what the Israeli government does there is rogue. I think that the way that the settlers behave is rogue. I think that the whole place is rogue. And I think that it's my job as a Jew to end the occupation, because I think it's killing the Jewish people, it's killing the state of Israel, it's having the most horrendous impact on Palestinians. I have no problem in saying that, but to sit here and say that, of course, why would we not end up with Bibi Netanyahu because of Zionism, I'm afraid is just simply incorrect. And if we're talking about upholding UN resolutions, there was something called the UN Resolution 181, which brought into existence the state of Israel. Okay, so if we're going to uphold UN resolutions, we have to uphold the fact that Israel has a right to exist according to international law. So I think that if that is the starting point of your conversation, it's a very different starting point from one which says you don't have a right to exist, so therefore, of course, you're going to let Bibi Netanyahu because that's the outcome of your racist state.
John answer
John,
directly, and then we can move on.
Okay, the practical question, you know, an institutional boycott. I mean, what it actually says in the PACB call of 2004 is refrain from participation in any form of academic and cultural cooperation, collaboration or joint projects with Israeli institutions. And, you know, I don't know, I mean, it may somehow, I mean, the thing is that there isn't a Leninist, vanguardist party that's dictating to everybody their strategy. And so there's no rigid doctrine that says, here's where the institution ends and here's where the individual begins. Because that's precisely not how the BDS campaign functions. There is some room for interpretation. But if you say, I won't go to a conference in Israel. I won't organise one. I won't speak at one or give a lecture there in an Israeli university. I won't participate in exchange programmes, the editorial boards of journals, do joint research projects at such universities. I won't accept academic posts there. I won't engage in fundraising initiatives for Israeli universities. They're all elements of boycotting institutions. It's very like the grey listing procedure in the university and college union. When a university does something that's that the union doesn't like, it says they initiate this system of where you don't attend, you don't, at an institutional level. But it does not mean and then there's a room for interpretation, but it doesn't mean that you therefore can't teach Israeli Jews, you can't hire Israeli professors, you can't read Israeli journals. I mean, on the question, how do you initiate a boycott of Israeli exports? Well, it's not that difficult, actually, to initiate a boycott of what Naomi Klein calls the sort of weapons field tested on Palestinians, because actually people, can see the clear moral questions used there. And so why is it not a racist campaign? Because it singles out Israel. I mean, the answer is because, it's a campaign that opposes the occupation and colonization of a people. It's a movement and a state's inability to take responsibility for the ethnic cleansing of 1948, and it's discrimination against Palestinian Arabs within pre-67 Israel. And so it's opposed to forms of racism and ethnocracy, settlement, colonization in all its forms. And that project is really quite an unusual project in the 21st century. I mean, is there any other state in the world that is right now engaged in a project which has all sorts of affinities with 19th century settler colonialism? China. Is there another state? China. Well, no. I mean, it's just not the same. And so is there a state that's violated, scores of UN resolutions, dozens of...
Well, let's occupy Israel.
Well, the thing is, but so then you have to say, so a campaign against, for example, the current movements against the tyranny of the Syrian regime in Syria, you have to take a decision. So what response do we have? An extraordinary thing. Did anybody say, while people were joining the BDS movement against apartheid South Africa, did anyone say, oh, you're singling out South Africa? What about Chile? What about Tibet? What about China? You shouldn't be involved in BDS for South Africa because you're a racist, because you're not taking into account all the other problems in the world. But what's wrong with, looking at a particular case, establishing that there's a problem, and then engaging in activism to try and deal with it? And no, you can't take on every issue on the planet. So I totally reject the idea. I think Israel has singled out itself. And
Yeah, just a quick. I think John dealt with most of it, so I don't have that much to do. Let me just say that, of course, South Africa had the right to exist, and Israel has the right to exist. Apartheid had no right to exist, and therefore we all work for the change of regime in South Africa. The kind of regime Israel maintains in the occupied territories, the kind of regime it maintains towards its Palestinian minority in Israel, and its kind of policies it pursues against Palestinian refugees have no right to exist. And I think that's what the campaign is all about. So let's not talk about the right to exist as something ephemeral that we don't know what we're talking about. We're talking about a change of regime, and we don't even suggest bombing the Israelis in order to change the regime, as we would have if it had been an Arab country. The second point is about other issues and why we're focusing. First of all, we are focusing on many issues. If you take the calendar of your run-of-the-mill kind of activists in London, I don't envy them. There are so many events which are not only about Palestine. Quite a lot of atrocities are going in the world, and we are involved in the campaign against them as well. Every period there is one particular issue that stands out because it really epitomizes double standards, hypocrisy, the abuses of power by political elites, by the Western media, especially when the Western political system is not honest with itself after pontificating to the rest of the world, then we can see the movement magneting around one issue. This was the case with Vietnam, this was the case with South Africa, this was the case of Chile. Today, this is the case study that is the litmus paper for the West's honest contribution for a better world. And if it will continue to single out Israel as a rogue state that is allowed to do whatever it wants, because it is the only democracy in the Middle East, the rest of the world, which is not part of the West, will continue to be in conflict with the West. So it's not just an issue about solving the problem in Palestine. It's about creating a much better world and the relationship between the West and those parts of the world that used to be colonized by the West in order to start a new kind of relationship.
Okay.